So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name's Jen Goldsack. I'm the CEO here at the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. I am delighted to welcome Ieuan from Evidation to talk about a piece that he and I really enjoyed actually writing together. Ieuan's going to lead the conversation today, but we had a lot of fun thinking about this idea of how sort of developing digital measures really takes a village, and in particular, what's the role of our sort of computing science colleagues and how do we better engage them? What are the questions we need to be answering that they are best positioned and suited to sort of dive in and share with us. Before I hand over to Ieuan and he takes us through some of our thinking in this manuscript, let me talk to you a little bit about how we run our journal clubs in case you haven't attended one before. So first of all, full disclosure, we are recording today's session. The good thing about that, it does mean that the recording and slides will be available through the DIME website. We will get that posted usually within 24 hours. So if you want to refer colleagues to this or come back to the slides, they are all available to you. Journal clubs are also one of, first of all, my favorite events on the monthly DIME calendar. They really are sort of collaborative. They are sort of discussion based. Once Ieuan's given some remarks and some views from sort of the author perspective on some of the points that we make in this piece, we will throw it open to discussion. So really encourage you, if you have questions, either drop them in the chat while Ieuan's speaking, or once we throw it open to discussion, you can sort of raise your hand. And if you're somewhere you can pose your question live, we welcome you to do that. Otherwise, we can just work from the chat. So housekeeping done. Again, this was a really, I think, interesting and important piece to put together. Ieuan, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to lead our discussion today. Thanks for being here. I know your schedule is bonkers right now. And actually, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow you to present your slides and spare you having to parrot next slide for the next few minutes.
Let's see if we can make this happen. Exciting. Everybody see this? Is this big enough?
Perfect.
Super, super. Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Jen. Yeah, real pleasure to be here and yeah, to talk about this paper that we put together. It's actually a conference paper that we did for MobiSys, which is an ACM conference that is primarily for or by and for computer scientists. And so really where it started, and if you want to read it, the DOI is at the top, and really where it started was sort of Jen and I realizing that there's an awful lot of frameworks and, guidance documents out there, and, which is great. It shows how much the field is starting to coalesce and is starting to come together and agree on what needs to be done in order to achieve certain things or make certain statements. But something we started to realize was really that they're very focused on, let's say, a few kind of stakeholder groups within the kind of digital health or digital measure world. There's quite a few sort of more conceptual frameworks, which are great in terms of kind of outlining exactly what, as I say, that we feel is an acceptable amount of evidence or required evidence for making certain statements. These tend to be more orientated towards sort of clinical leads or sort of the digital lead within a bigger program. There's a number of more operational frameworks and guidance documents, so really like discussing what you actually need to do to fulfill some of these frameworks, which tend to be more orientated towards study leads and people actually running these studies. And increasingly, actually, in the last year or two, there's actually a lot of kind of more sort of focus area specific frameworks. So you're really getting into the weeds around a specific topic of, so the examples I've kept here were kind of, of if you want to have a walking outcome in your trial collected from a digital device, what you need to think through, or if you want to have a speech-based digital measure, what you need to think through when you're planning your study or planning your product. And so what we really wanted to do was kind of expand that increasing literature to really include what, for me, one of the most important groups. And this was also the reason why we went to ACM MobiSys, because it is a conference for computer scientists. Is that because, as the title says, it really does take a village, and computer scientists are one of in my opinion, one of the most important people in that village, because these are the people who are going to be dealing with the data. These are the people who are going to be creating that interface from that data to the clinical team, who are going to be helping them understand what you can and can't say based on that data. You know, they are going to be the ones who are actually putting in place the code that converts your patient engagement work. You know, you're deciding what needs to be measured. They're going to be the ones that actually work out, okay, how do we actually convert this data into that concept? And so what we realized, as I say, was that there's actually surprisingly little literature out there speaking specifically to this group. And so we wanted to just go through in the paper some key topics and some key issues that are particularly important to computer scientists. And I use computer scientists in the biggest possible sense to include all the data analysts, the machine learners, the stats people, basically people who are coming from more of a technical background rather than necessarily an operation or a medical background, and who bring a lot of experience and perspective out of that world, but perhaps don't necessarily know some of the words and some of the approaches, which to someone coming out of a clinical background is perhaps more second nature. And so the paper is pretty straightforward. As I say, you know, we start just talking about some of the really basic aspects of a lexicon of like, what do we actually mean when we say digital measure? You know, what are the different pathways by which a digital measure can be used for decision making? And again, that's not necessarily obvious to someone who's coming from a different field. You know, it's very confusing when you see that, you know, Apple Watch has heart rate monitors, but it's not allowed to be used for decision making, or you can't use it as a primary endpoint. And what is a primary endpoint? You know, there's a lot of very specific terminology that maybe we are all used to using in our everyday life. But someone coming from a different field isn't necessarily used to that. And to put that section together, we lean very heavily on the digital medicine primer, which I have linked at the bottom here, which of course covers a huge amount of ground. And so we're just going to skim through it here. And as I say, really the aim of this whole section was just to get everybody speaking the same language so that we can refer to things and know what we're talking about. And we tried to kind of bucket the work into kind of a conceptual framework around the kinds of things that they're going to sort of encounter in their work with clinical teams. You know, they can understand, you know, that a clinical trial may include both active and passive assessments, that it may include, you know, medical grade data plus consumer grade data. You know, that like those are the kind of different challenges that they're going to be faced with. Those are the kind of different kinds of data that they're going to see, and that there's pros and cons to all of those different kinds of data. And at the end of the day, we need that range of data in order to understand these complex conditions. It's not that there is, you know, we prioritize one key metric, of course, the primary outcome, at least in clinical trials, but to understand a condition, it's more than just knowing someone's 6-minute walk time. And we then sort of went through a few challenges that are really specific to that group and the kind of things that they're going to see. And for the sake of time today, I'm just going to touch on 3 of them that I think are really key, both to the overall digital measurement development field, but it's really ones where you know, your friend from data analysis is going to have that biggest impact, and where maybe their background can actually help you a lot when if you're coming more from a clinical perspective. And so first and foremost is, of course, patient centricity. And I think some of you, maybe if you've worked with people coming from more of a tech background or a computer science background, who are more, you know, knowledgeable around product development in the kind of app sense or the tech sense, you'll be probably pleasantly surprised by how kind of obvious this is to them, you know, in the sense that, you know, nobody in the tech world would develop a product without first talking to the consumers of that product. And in the health world, those consumers are the patients, and that it is not standard across the field to really start and maintain stakeholder engagement throughout the whole process is probably going to be pretty eye-opening to them. And, you know, having their input into how you actually go through this process, you'll probably be surprised by how they actually think about it and how they ultimately map what people are talking about to what is actually measured. They may well actually be very, very familiar with some of these methodologies. And to put this section together, we lean very helpful on the very helpful paper, Measuring What Matters, which again, I linked to the bottom. And this is where this figure comes from, which just talks about how you go from those initial qualitative conversations with patients where you're talking about what aspect of their disease is it that really burdens them the most or that they're most worried about, through to actually measuring a specific thing in a trial or in the development of a product. And we included this nice example here where they've kind of talked about how that actually works in practice and how you may need to measure several things in order to get a good grasp on a single meaningful aspect of health. But as I say, this shouldn't be new to anybody on this call, but I think, again, I just want to underline that for people coming from a tech background, this will also not be new to them, and they may actually be great allies for you in pushing through these conversations in your organizations. The other thing that we wanted to talk on, of course, very near and dear to Jen's heart, validation. And so again, you know, we in digital measures, digital health, you know, we talk about V3, you know, verification, analytical validation, clinical validation. You know, we use that structure when we are building these things that we are building. You know, we understand what that means now. That's, you know, really accepted across the field. But again, when you're talking to maybe someone coming from a computer science background, you may be using different words, but they will understand what that framework is talking about once you get into the details. And this is because obviously reproducibility is a huge concept in computer science. And there, what they will often talk about is technical, statistical, and conceptual reproducibility, which maps perfectly to V3. And again, they will really understand that, you know, for them, they will be talking about, like, you know, does this thing do what I want it to do, not just in a controlled setting, but actually in practice. And again, that is exactly what we're trying to get towards with V3, right? We're trying to ensure that what we're measuring in a trial is actually relevant, is actually reproducible, is actually fit for the purpose that we're trying to do, and that it's going to carry through onto the market in the sense that patients will also care about what is being measured. And so, as I say, those conversations you may actually find to be much easier than you think when you're talking to your colleagues with computer science backgrounds. And again, they can be great allies in these conversations in terms of planning and strategizing how those different buckets of information can be collected when you're planning out those studies. The other thing that we talked a lot about, and this is probably a topic more dear to my heart, is the idea, and it's again a big part of reproducibility and transparency, which again is becoming much more important or much more pushed for by journals and other key stakeholders in the health world, is about making your code and your data available. So when you're making a statement as part of a paper, people can actually go and firstly just check that it really does work in that way, but hopefully also maybe build off your work and take it in a direction that maybe you didn't think of, or improve something that you hadn't thought about. And really sort of the whole open source movement really came out of computer science. And so again, you're going to have great allies there in terms of pushing those kinds of things forward. And just to show that I do practice what I preach, the screenshots are from a paper that we just recently put out, where we did in fact put the data and the code available for everybody. And it's increasingly easy to do. There are platforms to do this. And again, as I say, the benefits are there for everybody to see. And hopefully it just pushes the field forward, right? And then the last thing that we wanted just to highlight from that thing is, and I think this is one of the really most important conversations to have with people who are more on the technical side, assuming you're coming from the clinical side, is really about, how do we interpret the results of what we're seeing? And again, really this comes down to kind of two key sort of concepts I like to think about. Is obviously clinically meaningful change. And again, they will probably have a very good conceptual background in this. So they will really understand what it means to assess things using anchor-based methods. And so this is probably the most common. This is where you are, looking for change over time or change relative to an established metric. Or kind of doing known groups validation. So you're looking to see differences that you expect to be there. But they'll also be probably pretty well schooled in more statistical methods, which are going to be more based on the measurement precision of the measure that you're using, plus the variation of that measure within the population that you're looking at. And so this is really what is the smallest difference that we can reliably distinguish. They're, again, as I say, going to be very well schooled in this, and this opens up a lot of different approaches when you are actually thinking about developing a measure or deploying a measure into a trial. And the other aspect of this is really about what are the metrics that we're going to choose when we're actually making that statement that it worked or didn't work. How do we actually statistically justify that clinically meaningful change or that sensitivity has actually been reached? And so again, I include here a reference from my recent work where we were looking at trying to predict changes in depression. And so here in depression, obviously the cost of false positives and false negatives is very, very different. If someone is depressed and you miss them, the cost of that is very high. Whereas if you suspect someone is depressed but they're not, the cost of that is very low. They can just dismiss it, as would be the same for many kind of screening technologies or kind of diagnostic technologies. This is very, very common. So again, in this sense, when we're developing this new metric, we're really focusing on sensitivity and some other metrics where we're really trying to focus on, as I say, those false negatives. So really avoiding those situations where we're missing somebody. And in different situations, you're going to want to focus on different metrics. But again, those are conversations that you can have with people who are coming from a more technical background, and you'd be surprised at the kind of perspective that they bring. And so with that, I think, just say thanks to all of you. Obviously, thanks to Jen and to Dime for the invitation. And let's open it up for discussion. I'm really interested to hear what kind of experiences people have made or what particular challenges they've faced, or how they see bringing people of a technical background into digital health. Like how do they see that moving forward?
Ieuan, this was fantastic, and I invite folks who are in a position to pop on their video and sort of really dive into conversation to do so if you feel comfortable. While we wait for some questions to come in, maybe Ieuan, I'll kick us off. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that I felt sort of terribly proud of ourselves as a result of doing this. So I was like, we had something that was presented at a, computer science conference, and aren't we good sort of talking to our colleagues from across different disciplines? I think, one of the big challenges for the field more generally is, you called out time and time again how our computer science colleagues will be sort of great allies in sharing and promoting what we're determining as best practice. And I feel like we're not the best as a field in sort of integrating experts from across these silos. Shy of giving yourself a pat on the back where you turn up at one of these conferences, what can we do better?
I think, as is always the case in digital health, right? And as we not so subtly named the paper, right? It does take a village. And I think one of the more damaging things that, I see happening again and again and again is that people are brought to the party too late. The classic example is, of course, the You take your exploratory data set to your local statistician and ask them what it means. I think I've seen this scenario in about 1,000 different versions, and usually the answer is it's too late. Like it doesn't, I can't answer your question with this data. And I think really that early engagement, it really makes a huge difference, because as you say, then you really are going to have that ally. And as I said throughout as well, you also be surprised where they can contribute. It's not just, how are we going to analyze it? It's really understanding what information do you need in order to answer that question. What evidence do we need to gather in order to be able to make that statement? How can we really be sure that these two things are different, or that, this new measure reflects that established anchor? These sorts of conversations, again, as part of a technical background in computer science or related field, will cover that more philosophical material in great depth, in terms of, what is validity, and, when are things different, and really coming at it from a very technical perspective. And I think having them in that, most trials, most products are kicked off with a small core team, right? I think that's pretty standard practice at this point, before you bring in maybe other stakeholders and specialists. And I think having someone really from a technical background in that core team is absolutely critical. And certainly in my experience, so for example, like when I worked at Novartis, your core trial team included somebody from, the analysis side of things, because of exactly that reason. And they were alongside the operational lead, the clinical lead, the statistical lead. Really that formed the core of that trial team, and for exactly that reason.
And I love that as an example, and I'm really curious to hear if any sort of folks on the line have additional examples of how we've done that better. And, Ieuan, one of the things that you were sort of mentioning, and you had a number of different examples, I think about so many of the elements that our sort of clinical colleagues would sort of report as being challenges, right? Whether it's the need to sort of synthesize data from, consumer technologies alongside sort of more proven out sort of medical devices, whether it's, understanding whether a measure matters or not, and having actually had a conversation, with the patients themselves. It seems to me, and I bang this drum a lot, and I want you to check me if you think I'm overstating, but it seems to me that these sort of challenges that really are bottlenecks for the field right now could largely be overcome if we just better partnered with our colleagues who are sort of experts in these sorts of areas.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, collaboration is core to this, right? I mean, it's again, I think, for someone perhaps coming from maybe like a product development background, or who's worked in more of a commercial setting, as many people maybe now working in pharma in a data science role will have, they will have come from a company like, Booking or Spotify or Amazon or whoever, right? More of a commercial facing enterprise. Again, they will be very used to having all those different stakeholders in the room, and that stereotype of the the technical person who maybe can't talk to anybody else, this is just vastly inaccurate. Obviously there are special people in every field, but I think again, most people with this kind of background, they want to do something with their skills, like, as do we all, right? We all want to have impacts, we all want to move things forward, and that concept that you are part of a bigger program or a bigger study you know, this is often what brings people then into healthcare, you know, to apply their skills to healthcare. And so they are there to work with you, right? And that, I think, is really important to kind of take to heart and realize that, you know, that collaborative work is what will motivate many people to have come to healthcare. You know, they could probably earn more money if they went to a bank or stayed at Amazon, but they want to do something meaningful with their hard-earned skills. And, you know, bringing them into that conversation early and looking at the perspective that they bring, and whether that be about you know, bringing participants into the design process early, or, you know, thinking about different statistical approaches for generating the kind of evidence that you want to do. You know, these are all conversations that they're going to be very used to having. And I think it's, you know, again, yeah, it is a collaboration. You know, nothing gets done by one person in a clinical setting. You know, that I think we all, but I think sometimes, yeah, it does sort of sometimes amaze me how uninvolved or late involved, you know, our colleagues from either the analysis group or from the statistical group are. You know, and I think that's definitely definitely something to avoid.
I'm pausing for a second. I want to make sure I'm not skipping over any raised hands. It doesn't look like we have any right now. I want to build on that, and I please warmly invite folks to pose a question if you have one. There was one bit of the manuscript, Ieuan, and you wrote this. Folks who have dialed in, this is what's fun about sort of having one of these conversations with your co-authors, as you can sort of ascribe these bits and pieces. And I think it builds on what you say about sort of the need to make sure that we are better engaging sort of our partners in this. And this was really powerful to me. You know, you sort of said that this is still a new field, and in the rush to be first, the temptation to cut corners is strong. And we need to hold ourselves accountable and set very high standards for our work. Ultimately, these measures are being deployed to guide health relevant decisions for people whose health is significantly impacting their quality of life. I really like that. And I really like this conversation about, you know, we need to do better at collaborating. My question sort of is, like, who's accountable for this, right? If we think about, you know, these teams, you defined a core team that had a member of the sort of computing science community, you know, in different instantiations as part of the core team. Like, for those of us doing this kind of work, who's accountable for making sure that we don't take it to our sort of friendly biased statistician too late, and we've actually just wasted everyone's time, including the participants?
Thank you for firstly. You wrote this bit. I take full responsibility, because I do really agree. I think certainly in my career, I think there has been an evolution away from this kind of pass the parcel way of working, you know, where there is, you know, a person over, you know, who has oversight and accountability. And of course, in most organizations, there ultimately is one person who represents that trial or that product or that program. Simply because, you can't bring the entire product team into a meeting kind of thing. You know, there is still, you know, the buck has to stop somewhere. But in the daily work of that team, I have definitely seen an evolution away from that kind of, you know, linear, you know, very kind of stay in your lane way of working. You know, I think the sort of the accountability and ownership really does, at least in what I've seen over the last, you know, sort of more recent year or two, is it has become much more dispersed across that whole team. And again, that comes back to how these teams are being set up, and that when you have everybody in the room up front, there is a lot more ownership, and people do feel more invested into what they're doing because their voice has been heard and they think it is being done in a good way, and you know, it's going to reach the goals that it has. And you know, that's, I think, probably true of how we work generally, but it is definitely true of clinical trials and of measure development and product development. So I think, yeah, that kind of early engagement, yeah, really, again, just comes to the fore in terms of that ownership and people really feeling that it's their project rather than I have, yeah, 20 projects on my desk and I'm just trying to triage them in order of urgency, kind of, then, you're not going to be innovating in that setting. You're not going to be going the extra mile to do patient interviews up front. You're just going to rinse and repeat because that's all the time that you've got. And I think some of that ultimately does come down to bandwidth restriction, that, it is about choosing your battles. And I think a lot of companies are starting to do that, are starting to, divest parts of their portfolio that maybe don't fit as well with the rest, are starting to make bigger bets on things that they feel are real value. I think that's probably a trend across the industry. And I think one of the consequences of that is that people are working on fewer, bigger things rather than, I'm just an executor and I do my particular function and I come in, I run a linear model and then I'm out. It's sort of, that ownership, that passion around what you're doing, I think is starting to become more the everyday, I think, or at least what I've seen. I don't know if people have other experiences.
I'm never afraid of like a longer pause in case people want to drop in, and I encourage folks to do so. Sarah actually had to drop for another meeting. She put a really good question in the chat that I want to make sure we address so she can check it on the recording and everyone else can learn from it. Before we do that, I want to tease a little bit on the thread that you've just sort of started here, Ieuan, with your thinking. One of the things we did, and folks, not everyone might be familiar with this, as part of our work on the playbook, we actually conducted a really interesting exercise that's called darkly, a premortem. So what the premortem exercise does, and what we actually did as part of this work, was we imagined a state of sort of hypothetical failure. And in this particular case, we set it up that we sort of developed and deployed a digital measure in a sort of trial that we were putting together our evidence packet ready to submit to a regulatory colleague, and realized we can't do this, we've made a mistake. And then we unpacked that and sort of really dug into it and said, look, what on earth could possibly have happened in order that this could be a hypothetical state? Because that is something that a lot of, quite rightly, industry colleagues fear. And one of the things that sort of emerged as a root cause there was, as we include these digital measures as endpoints, just as you said, Ieuan, like we try and apply our usual timelines. And it's not that these tools necessarily slow things down. There are areas where they may speed up a trial timeline, for example, in sort of recruitment, or how quickly we can capture data, because now it's much more high resolution. But early on in the planning stage, with a focus on milestones, what emerged from this exercise was, taking the time to make sure the measure matters in the first place, and we're not just collecting a lot of very expensive data that we can't use, taking the time to make sure that the analytical validation is done sufficiently well, that we understand the sort of complexity of, variation in the data, that we're certain that this measure performs in different sort of patient groups, for example, that are in scope for a given trial. When we think about this, it all seems that not doing it by rote, like you said, not doing the copy paste approach, allowing our sort of computer science colleagues to really flex their muscles a bit and use their expertise and guide us as equal partners is critical. Do you have sort of an example in mind that you could share where we've managed to offset something at the pass, or before it's become a problem because we've taken the time to have, sort of computer science expert at the table?
I think maybe a sort of a good example. I mean, I've always been a big sort of fan of piloting things and doing things early, and I think this obviously is influenced a lot by sort of where I came from. Like, I was a part of early development, so we did a lot of the smaller scale studies, and I think one of the things that we often saw, especially when we were collaborating with colleagues who are working on the later stage pipeline, is that you do have a bit more freedom maybe in those early stage studies, and it does allow you to do some of that upfront work. And I think really that is very helpful, because obviously when you get to those later stage studies, then the pump is on and it becomes, the primary challenge is operational, and there are big budgets flying around and big numbers, and it's a very, very different pressure. And the sort of the appetite for risk and exploratory work is much smaller. But again, it comes back to this idea of collaboration, is that if you do have good collaboration between those late stage and early stage colleagues, you do have that opportunity to do some of that more foundational work, as you say, like measures that matter, doing all of those other aspects that you need to maybe plan for, which don't happen overnight. Like, for example, developing a new measure, you can start that earlier on. This was really exactly how I actually entered into digital health, right? So I think probably the example, maybe not the best example, but certainly the example I know or is the closest to my heart, that's pretty much exactly how it happened. Is that we had early assets in a muscle wasting condition where we felt we had a big opportunity as a company, and we invested a lot. Even to, for example, like doing a lot of the patient engagement and clinical work of actually establishing this condition as a real condition, which it wasn't really understood so at the time. But we also understood that the measures that we have in that space around really understanding real world frailty and really understanding the burden these patients were facing were completely inadequate, because they had literally been copy and pasted from COPD. And so, yeah, we were talking about 6-minute walk test at the time. And that's where we got starting to think about, okay, how can we actually measure really the limitations that someone is facing in their real life? How can we do it in a way that doesn't burden them? How can we do it in a way that is fit for older patients, because this is primarily a geriatric condition? And that work took years, but we were able to do it because we had such good alignment with the later stages. And once that initial pilot was off, it got put straight away into 2 phase 2Bs. And we had all of that work done so that when those studies started to move towards phase 3, unfortunately, the asset, or at least in those indications, didn't work. Actually, has been recently acquired and is now going to be tried in a completely different indication. But those conversations that we had with our colleagues in later development were, really collaborative, really collegial, because we had that work done and they saw the investment that we had made. And we'd significantly de-risked what would normally be a very exploratory conversation for them, and in reality would probably have not found a place in those large-scale trials. But because we had done that work up front, we had that opportunity.
I really like that as an example, and as you know from personal preference, any example that moves us away from being over tethered to the 6-minute walk test is a win, in my opinion. I want to make sure, and we'll do this as a last question because it's a great one that came in from Sarah. She was reflecting on sort of the power of the V3 framework. Self-reports as a strong reproducibility advocate, so like-minded with you and certainly with us there. One of the things that I think is really interesting in the manuscript that sort of Sarah teased out a little bit as well is some of the language around the sort of computer science background. And right here it says, an endpoint which, like a product version, is fully validated and stable. I like the idea of not thinking just about validation, which is no mean feat in and of itself. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of sort of stability, especially vis-a-vis these sort of drug development timelines.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think probably the challenge that everybody has seen is say you're running a large phase 3, this is probably a 3 to 5 year undertaking. And even if you have done all of your homework and you've chosen a fit for purpose technology and you've audited your vendors and you've, you know, scaled the deployment and your operations are running slick, you know, there's a very high likelihood that that technology is going to be pretty out of date within a year or two. And then what do you do? And this is oftentimes one of the challenges, at least I've seen it in my time. Often one of the reasons why technologies are not included into trials is that, you know, that stability is not there and people are not comfortable dealing with that. I think, again, you know, this is kind of the magic of V3. Again, it's not a static thing, right? You know, fit for purpose is a dynamic conversation and it changes as your options change. And, you know, so again, you know, if you do need to go from one version to another, you now have a framework to actually assess whether or not the new version is measuring what the old version was. And, you know, and a lot of the work is already done up front because you now have all of those anchors in place. You know what you need to be able to detect. And it really, you know, it helps you be confident that you are providing patients with the best technology you can, you know, but at the same time you are, you know, you're maintaining that bridge to the measures that, you know, or like sort of the classically accepted measures, right? You know, you're not going to be losing that, and that evidence package that you have at the end is still going to be valid because you know all of that evidence, all that evidence is still valid and fit for purpose, right? And you can evolve. And again, I think a lot of studies are, for example, starting to use more kind of bring your own device approach, because they, you know, they want to give patients that freedom to choose. They want them to use a device that is anyway integrated into their life. And then, you know, then it's not just a case of a kind of planned transition from one version to another of a particular device. You know, then you're dealing right from day one with a diversity of different readouts, a diversity of different technologies. And then again, you know, you have that framework of, okay, at what level am I comparing the information coming from all those different sources? At what level am I actually interpreting it? And what level can I be confident in it? You know, all of these sorts of things are laid out in the framework. And it allows you, as I say, it just gives you a conceptual framework for kind of thinking through these things.
Yeah, and I think, you know, and I think you're exactly right. I would agree that one of the most powerful things about sort of the V3 framework is that it allows us to think of the sort of digital measurement product as sort of a tech stack almost, right? So that as sensor capabilities improve, we're not tethered to something, you know, especially, I mean, I was going to say sort of circa 2007, which feels like a million years ago in terms of the sort of technology we were all carrying around at the time. But in drug development timelines, it's really not that long ago, right? So the ability to be able to sort of switch out the underlying sort of data capture product. And what's really nice is that's very much in line with what we see in other areas, even in the health field, right? If you think about how CDRH looks at software as a medical device, right? They ask you, what's your verification protocol for anything you might want to capture the data on, right? This is something that we see elsewhere. And then, you know, V3 also gives us the ability to continue to improve and adapt that, the sort of the algorithm itself. It gives us the ability to sort of translate these measures into new populations because we don't think of it as a monolithic sort of tool. It is this sort of tech stack, which again, let's go back to our sort of computer science friends. This is something that you are much more sort of used to wrapping your heads around. It's much more comfortable, and we have to lean into where you have sort of comfort and experience and sort of embrace that to continue making progress here on the clinical side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also like the example of kind of, you know, bridging from one population to another, you know, and that might be, for example, you know, you're going from a very well-defined trial population into more of a real-world evidence setting, you know, where you're maybe also then transitioning from, you know, a research-grade device into a consumer-grade device. You know, like these sorts of transitions happen all the time in the life of clinical programs. And again, by having this framework, you've actually already done a lot of the homework you're going to need to do, and you don't need to do the whole framework. As long as you can show on a fundamental level they're measuring the same thing, then you build out from there. And so I think by taking that more structured approach, you're also making your life easier in the long run. And at the end of the day, the hope that we have, of course, is that the trial is successful. And at that point, then you're going to want to submit that package, and taking a structured approach, taking an approach, as you said, that is actually, you know, promoted by the health authorities themselves these days. It just helps you because you're not trying to shoehorn some package of evidence into that framework. It is that framework, and that means they are comfortable about what they're going to be seeing, and you know, you're not going to have to go back to the drawing board and run a small side study to fill a gap, you know, and all of these sorts of things that we all know happen all the time. You know, as I say, I feel like that kind of upfront foundational work is just really critical. So yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. And yes, sadly, I think we do all know that happens all the time. And, you know, increasingly, I think being eyes wide open to the potential challenges and making sure that we're sort of primed and ready to address those is absolutely key. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and steal screen sharing back from you just for a hot second. And I want to do a couple of things before we move towards sort of wrapping up for the day. I want to just give everyone on the line, first of all, thank you for joining us. Ieuan, this was absolutely wonderful. Again, I really enjoyed putting this paper together. I really enjoyed thinking about the importance of sort of the computer science, not as those colleagues, not as an audience, but as our partners in this, and sort of doing the work and thinking about the benefits that better collaboration bring, not only to our work on a day-to-day basis, but also the patients that we're here to serve. So this was terrific. And thank you everyone on the line for sort of dialing in and being part of this. And we have to get better at sort of banging this drum together. I also wanted to plug a couple of things coming up on the DIME calendar, just for folks on the line. We have our September webinar tomorrow, actually, and a really interesting conversation coming up to really help us think about sort of patient engagement and activation for sort of better adherence when it comes to digital platforms. A slight spoiler alert, I suspect we will also be talking about upstream considerations as well as tools and resources available on deck once something goes live in the world. And then our next journal club is actually going to be discussing a publication from the playbook that gets published tomorrow. And I love the title of this, Show Me the Money. Academic research is critical to building trust. This JIMA manuscript that will come out tomorrow really dives into where are the pockets of research happening vis-a-vis digital clinical measures by our academic colleagues, where are the gaps? And we found that there are some pretty broad gaps that we ought to discuss, and where are the funding opportunities and the funding gaps. So we welcome you to join us for another journal club next month as we dive in on this JIMA publication from the playbook. And with that, we're on target. We are always trying to end a few minutes early. We know everyone's in back-to-back Zooms. Ieuan, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone on the line, thanks so much for being here today. The recording and the slides will be available up on the website within the next 24 hours or so, along with our the persistent link, the DOI for the publication. So thanks everyone, and look forward to seeing you hopefully at some upcoming events.
Thanks everyone, bye.
Bye-bye.